I'm Gauri Trivedi. Let's start the show with headlines this evening. First up, in his very first sermon in 5 years, Iran's supreme leader makes a pitch for unity of Muslim countries, says Muslim nations have common enemy, even as tensions in the region continue and the world remains on the edge. How much is India impacted, and can New Delhi play any role in this region? In his annual piece for Foreign Affairs, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken names China and Russia as revisionist powers. As response, Blinken says that U.S. must reinforce its ties with partners and allies and double down on mechanisms like the Quad. As India attempts to lead the global south, it increases its engagement with CARICOM nations. Andrew Holness becomes the first Prime Minister from Jamaica to visit India. The two countries signed key pacts including defense, trade and security. Former US Secretary Larry Summers tells NDTV that India should focus more on services to fulfill its true economic potential. Summers says technology will reduce manufacturing sector's job creation prospects.
Optimistic. I think that India does have the prospect of, for quite some time, being the greatest growth prospect in the world.
India and the United States are set to sign a pact for critical minerals. The move will allow guaranteed supply of raw materials needed for all major industries, including India's semiconductor ambitions. It will also China-proof global supply chains. All right, the big story on India ascends. The West Asia crisis, the tensions in the Middle East have now escalated sharply. A broader conflict is very much likely. India shares good relations with all players. With Israel, it has deep defense and security collaboration. It has also, in fact, with Iran, it is India's largest oil supplier till the United States sanctioned Tehran. But the question to ask is, where does India stand in this conflict? So far, New Delhi has been very clear. It stands against terror, with peace, and in favor of a long-term resolution. Before we talk about how the geopolitical dynamics of the region is set to play out, take a look at this report that tells you the direct and immediate impact, both economic and social, on India of what's happening in the Middle East right now.
موجه للأمة الإسلامية جمعاء.
New Delhi has been in a wait-and-watch mode since the 7th of October attack by Hamas on Israel last year. And with the situation quickly spiraling into a major conflict, policymakers in India need to brace for a significant impact from these tensions. For one, there are nearly 90 lakh Indians in the entire Middle East. A broader war could put most of them at risk, requiring the government to ensure safety and possibly swift evacuation. This would also hit the $87 billion of annual remittances that India receives from the Middle East region. A conflict in this region will also risk India's energy supplies, besides making it costlier. A higher crude will affect India's finances, affecting both current account deficit and trade deficit. Oil crossing $100 a barrel is no more a distant possibility. At risk is also the Chabahar port, one of India's most recent strategic investments to build linkages with the Central Asian markets and to counter rising Chinese presence in the region. All right, India has a large exposure to this region. Is it in a position to mediate, and is a full-scale war now imminent? That's the question. For one, mediation requires leverage. India is a growing power, but it still has very limited leverage on all parties to ensure any breakthroughs that are needed. Secondly, unlike the attack on Gaza, where a response came from the entire Muslim world, Israel's attacks on Iran have not led to any widespread condemnation because of the fault lines that exist in the Muslim world, whether it's Shia, Sunni, Arab, Persian, pro-West, anti-West. And not everyone is then throwing their lot behind Tehran, which means Iran knows that the escalation will have only limited appeal. And this also explains Iran's supreme leader Khamenei's rallying call for all Muslims around the world today after the Friday prayers. Now, at stake is the leadership of the entire Muslim community. Thirdly, there are internal political factors that are also at play. The Iranian dispensation, mind you, is very unpopular. The anger that started with the hijab protest still simmers, and escalation could just add to that political uncertainty for its leadership. And lastly, Iran's military arsenal, though significant, is not unlimited. Figures aren't available, but at some point of time, its ballistic missiles will get exhausted. It fired 180 ballistic missiles. How many more can it fire? 200, 300, 500 at best. This is why this is a situation where the interplay of political, military and geopolitical realities makes it complex, dynamic and that much harder to predict. Shifting now focus to the wide-angle story on the show, which is coming in from Pakistan. Should India be worried about the security situation that is unraveling in Pakistan? The short answer to that is yes. The reason for that is Imran Khan. He's deeply he's popular. He remains so even after being in prison for more than a year. And most importantly, his rally call for protest has been answered by his protesters. There's been unprecedented police deployment. Shipping containers have actually been put on the streets of Islamabad to ensure that Imran Khan supporters don't come. Schools have been shut, internet suspended, curfew imposed. All that the administration can possibly do. But reports seem to suggest, maybe some of them are still early in the day to suggest exact numbers coming in. It could be about anywhere around 900 to 1,000 people from Imran Khan's party have been arrested. Why? Because there is a support base for him. What does this mean? That Shahbaz Sharif's government may now be on borrowed time. All of Shahbaz Sharif's efforts have been to ensure that it keeps Imran Khan away from power, and it's not yielding. The latest constitutional amendments and changes that he wants to bring in are because of the court reprieve that Imran Khan's party received. Pakistan is a nuclear power. It's unstable, and its fractured and broken polity is now jostling with power. The illegitimacy, one may say, of the Sharif government will become untenable given the fact that Imran Khan is and remains extremely popular. To deflect all of this, what is the Pakistani army and the deep establishment going to do? Well, it's going to push the pedal on terrorism, cross-border terrorism against India, creating more tensions, which is the reason why tensions could continue in Pakistan and would add to India's security dynamic. All right, shifting focus now to the big voice on the show. It is José Manuel Barroso joining me on the broadcast to talk more about, well, the global conflict that is taking place and the number of wars that are taking place. Mr. Barroso, thank you so much for joining me on the show. As a former president of the European Commission, former Prime Minister of Portugal. In fact, sir, let me start by asking you about what is happening in the Middle East right now. How do you view this, and how do you see these tensions impacting the world, particularly, in fact, Europe as well?
Yes, I believe the geopolitical situation is getting worse day by day. In fact, what we had in Europe was extremely serious. We have the first full-scale war after the Second World War, I mean the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that is, in fact, linked with many other developments. Much bigger competition between the United States and China. And this is, of course, getting the global geopolitical landscape much more risky, volatile, more fragmented. And now we have this issue here in the Middle East. I mean, it's not now. We had it for decades, but sometimes it goes up, as we are seeing now, with, in some cases, unprecedented escalation. So, yes, I'm concerned. I know that there are some efforts to try to contain these developments. I hope it will happen, but frankly, I'm not optimistic. If I want to be sincere, I think the situation will probably get worse. That's
a very, very serious assessment that you are making, Mr. Mr. Barroso, of this situation. Then let me ask you, as far as something that Mario Draghi said recently in a report. He's the former Prime Minister of Italy, and he said that, in fact, that Europe faces an existential crisis right now and an existential threat from both China and Russia. How do you respond to those concerns?
I very much agree. I mean, if you read the report is a wake-up call to the European leaders and the European opinion about the need to invest more in our competitiveness. I mean, Europe is a great place to be. I mean, Europe is one of the most, let's say, developed and prosperous regions in the world. But we have problems, namely demographic problem. We have problems also with some kind of competitiveness. We have been losing some competitiveness to the United States and also to China in some ways. So that's why Mario Draghi, who is, by the way, a friend, former also president of the European Central Bank, is telling we have to invest more in our own competitiveness. So while Europe remains overall a very prosperous area, I mean, and where with very high levels of economic and social development, there are risks that if we don't adapt our economy to a more challenging environment, we may fall behind. And that's basically what Mario Draghi says. And I believe that this wake-up call will be well heard, loud and clear, in the capitals of Europe, because there is this sentiment that we need to promote some reforms to become more competitive.
All right. Then let me also ask you about EU's first defense minister. Is defense and ramping up of military spends really going to define Europe going forward? Because you now have a defense minister for the very first time.
Yes, because there is a war in Europe. There is a war. I mean, Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of the European Union, nor NATO, but it's our neighbor, very close. And precisely to avoid that war to go to other parts of Europe, for instance, that will be much dramatic if Russia invades a European Union or a NATO country. The Europeans are now getting prepared for that. So yes, there will be more investment in defense, no doubts about it. There is now the European Commission designated the Commissioner for Defense. It's more for defense industries because defense remains a national competence. But we are trying to see in Europe what we can do to reinforce our defense, certainly. And by the way, it's not just Europe, it's all over the world. If you see what's going on in the United States, China, and other parts of the world, we see a rise in defense expenditure.
You're speaking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and let me ask you, what role can mediation play, and what role can India play in some of these mediation efforts?
We have an ambitious
all those who believe they can help, they should help, of course, and India is a very important member of the global community, so certainly all efforts are welcome. Having said that, and if once again we want to be sincere and honest, intellectually honest, I don't think there will be a sustainable solution in the short term. It's possible there will be kind of a ceasefire or some kind of armistice or some kind of, let's say, frozen conflict. Probably next year there will be stronger efforts of diplomacy. Now people are waiting for the United States elections. But I don't see, frankly, and I know very well Russia, I know Mr. Putin I met him many times, I know Ukraine, and I don't see a true reconciliation possible. Even if we come to some kind of provisional diplomatic solution, unfortunately, I think the tension will remain. And that's why in the European Union and also in NATO, people are prepared. Prepare for war to avoid war. It's the old Roman saying that if you want peace, you should be prepared for war. Not because we want war. Nobody in Europe wants war. But of course, to avoid it, we have to be strong enough to show that there are no good ideas if people want to enlarge war. So, yes, a possible solution for a ceasefire may happen, but I don't see in the short, medium term a real reconciliation between Russia and Ukraine. After the World War in Europe, the two world wars we have now, I mean, the European Union, I received the Nobel Peace Prize for the European Union in 2012 because we made it impossible wars between the countries of the European Union, between France and Germany and at that time UK or it's impossible to conceive wars between European Union countries. But unfortunately, in the wider Europe, when you think about Russia, this is not the case. So that's why it's important to, if possible, make peace, but make a peace that has conditions to be respected and agreements to be honored.
If you say it's going to be frozen peace, then how do you see this conflict actually being resolved?
I think there will be some diplomatic efforts to come to an agreement. Unfortunately, I don't see the willingness, namely on Russia, to come to that agreement. There will be, if Russia leaves Ukraine, there will be peace. Russia today is occupying around 20% of the Ukraine territory. Russia is the biggest country in the planet, geographically speaking, and they are invading a member of the United Nations, a country to which they promised the respect of territorial integrity and national sovereignty. So, without Russia accepting that that country has the right to exist in its own borders, it's very difficult, even if there is some kind of ceasefire, to have a sustainable peace for the long term. Look, and there are problems that last for decades. If you think about Korea, between North Korea and South Korea, there is no war now, but there is also no peace. There is a kind of a frozen conflict. They are the two armies in front of each other. So, and that's, I'm afraid, what can happen in Ukraine and Russia. If there is not if Russia does not leave Ukraine, I'm afraid that even if there is some kind of truce, some kind of ceasefire, it will not be sustainable in terms of the global architecture. That explains why, for instance, Finland and Sweden joined NATO. Before the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it was unthinkable to have Finland and Sweden in NATO. But now they feel threatened. Finland has a big border, it's the biggest border with Russia. That's why NATO now is being reinforced. So, and this is the reality.
Mr. Barroso, thanks much for speaking to NDTV, and some very important insights he gave, including the fact that it could just be like North Korea and South Korea, a frozen peace. And on that note, we slip into a very short break. We come back with lots more on the other side. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching India Sense with me, Gauri Trivedi. Now, climate concerns are real, and they are now. A typhoon in Taiwan, there's a hurricane in US, and there have been underground fires in Arctic. But it's now affecting the developed countries like never before in ways they didn't imagine. Will it pave the way for richer nations to do more by doing less to make the planet warmer? Find out in this report. For decades, there was a false sense of security in developed nations about climate being a third world problem. It's no more the case. The devastating Hurricane Helene has brought dams in North Carolina and Tennessee almost to their breaking point. Reports suggest many dams in the US were not built for this high level of precipitation that climate change has now caused. In the last decade, Michigan, Minnesota, and Connecticut have witnessed partial or complete dam failures due to climate change. In fact, the devastating Hurricane Helene, which caused $160 billion of losses, is a grim reminder that even in the US, people as far as Western Carolina were hit by the hurricane. It's clear more needs to be done, and needs to be done now. Developed nations must double the funding for climate technology, pay for their past 200 years of industrial activity, and offer more aid for developing and poor nations that are hit even more than the US. There are no safe havens in the world from climate catastrophes, and developed nations must know that now. That report tells you how precarious the situation is of the world's biggest polluter, United States. But now let's quickly take a look at some of the other important stories in the segment Quick Take. In a big boost to India's ties with the Caribbean and New Delhi's push towards leadership of the Global South, Andrew Holness is the first Jamaican Prime Minister to visit India. The two countries signed pacts for digital public infrastructure and identified defense, security and trade as areas of cooperation. Jamaica, with its growing economic potential and strategic location, is a vital partner in the broader regional context of India's engagement with the CARICOM nations. Climate, smart grid, electric vehicles and energy transition are key areas where the two nations can build on this momentum. Aimed to protect the interest of small investors, to mitigate default risks due to over-leveraged positions, and to check excessive speculation, India's markets regulator SEBI announced a slew of measures to transform the equity derivatives landscape. 6 key measures aimed to hike lot sizes, to ensure closer monitoring, and other measures were brought in. These measures came after a SEBI study showed India's 1.13 crore retail F&O traders incurred a combined loss of 1.81 lakh crore rupees in the last 3 years, with just 7% individual F&O traders making a profit. With retail investors doubling in volume from 51 lakh to 96 lakh in just 2 years, the regulator's move will ensure household savings in India do not go towards F&O gambling and move towards productive investments. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken makes a pitch for a radical change to the United Nations Security Council. In his annual write-up for Foreign Affairs magazine, Blinken suggests a complete overhaul of the permanent seat, which only 5 countries have at present. Besides India, Blinken has made a case for inclusion of Germany, Japan, 2 African countries, 1 Latin American country, and 1 small island nation chosen via an election. These changes, which are more aspirational in nature, are unlikely to actualize anytime soon. In short, UNSC will remain trapped in its post-World War II mindset.